host of the Puck Portfolio, Canada Sports Betting's new hockey podcast, where I provide projections, betting advice, strategy, and pick the brains of smart hockey people from around the NHL to help you make more informed bets this NHL season. Join me weekdays, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the Canada Sports Betting YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. And by joining me each weekday, I hope that you'll understand just how much work goes into trying to win at sports betting. It's a full-time job, and I hope that I'll be able to take the load off of some of you, and anybody that wants to learn about betting can do so knowing that I've got their back, and I'll have all the time in the world to answer any questions that you have along the way. The Puck Portfolio is going to have something for everybody: hockey fans, bettors of all skill levels. And while the goal is to win, more importantly, we're here to have fun and not bet more than we can afford to lose. Responsible gambling is super important, and it will be a focus of this show, but we're not going to get to everything in one episode. For now, especially if you're new to sports betting, tread lightly. You're going to feel a lot more informed and a lot more comfortable with all of this as the show goes on, and of course as the season goes on. But now let me tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about my process, and how I got started in sports betting. So at the start of each new NHL season and throughout, I run a simulation tens of thousands of times to project regular season points based on factors like team strength, scheduling, and historical trends from around the league. This allows me to estimate just how often teams will hit certain milestones like winning their respective division, making the playoffs, or even hoisting the Stanley Cup, and a whole lot more. Some people will say that I'm a nerd, and maybe that's true. In fact, that's why I started making predictions and betting on sports in the first place. Sure, I wanted to win just like everybody else, but I was mostly bored. I was tired of having the same old conversations about hockey, and I always felt like an outsider because of it. So sports betting allowed me to get connected to the game that I love in a way that made sense to me. I didn't know it would lead me to working in sports for the better part of the last decade. First in betting as an originator, and now in sports media. I was just on the grind, working a blue collar job like a lot of you. So forgive me if I seemed a little bit uncomfortable on Hockey Night in Canada. Now, I think I did a pretty good job, all things considered, but I was live in front of millions of people every night. It was a great experience. I'm sure I'll talk about it more throughout the season, but this is where I want to be, right in the thick of it. But let's get back on track. So as an originator or a handicapper, I start by making odds, sort of like a sports book does, using various forms of statistical analysis. And then I use that information to try and find good bets. I'd say it's a process that's served me pretty well so far, and a lot of people would agree, but I will let you be the judge of that throughout this season. All right, as you can see, first up, it's the Atlantic Division. Number 8, the Montreal Canadiens. We're going worst to first here if you haven't guessed already. Montreal is coming off a disappointing season, and they're not far enough along in their rebuild to be a serious threat in the Eastern Conference this season. But for what it's worth, I do have them projected to finish with 74.7 average points, and that's roughly 3 more points than the regular season point total. But I decided against tying up a small portion of my bankroll on the Canadiens long term, as I'm sure there will be opportunities to back them as a big underdog throughout the season, and that's good enough for me, really. You always want to consider opportunity cost. You don't have an infinite bankroll, right? In fact, if you're being responsible, you've only got a certain amount of funds set aside specifically for this purpose, and you want to consider whether it's worth tying up funds for an entire season on a particular bet before making that bet. Maybe that portion of your bankroll could be used more wisely elsewhere, put to better use elsewhere, which probably applies to the number 7 team as well, the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings are projected to finish with 85.6 average points, and that's closely in line with their regular season points total, which is currently sitting at 85.5. But I have a major disagreement with the sports books when it comes to Red Wings and their playoff chances, despite the fact that GM Stevie Y brought in 2-time 40 goal scorer Alex DeBrincat. I see the Red Wings missing the playoffs about 84% of the time. At least that's what the forecast says. And if you convert that to American odds, you'll end up with minus 520. That means betting on the Red Wings at minus 200 to miss the playoffs is actually a pretty good bet, but I get that it's probably too rich for most people, and that's not a big deal. The bigger point that I'm trying to make here is that Detroit, who I think a lot of people see as maybe a fringe playoff team, they're not quite there yet. They're not a good bet to make the playoffs, and neither are the Buffalo Sabres. They were the second most profitable team in the NHL in 2022-23, but they crushed their regular season points total. It was 77 and a half. They finished with 91 points. And of course, they've been elevated to fringe playoff team with a regular season point total of 92 and a half. And I think that's a tad too high, according to the forecast anyway, which has Buffalo finishing with 91.7 average points. The Sabres made the playoffs roughly 39% of the time, which means there's a better chance that I'll be betting against Buffalo in games to start the season than there is that I'll be betting on them, because it seems as if the consensus opinion on the Sabres is that they're a bona fide playoff team. I don't think that's the case. That said, I don't think there's much value betting against them to miss. Buffalo, they were a fun team last year, but it looks like I'm going to have to find a new dog to back in 2023-24, because there's a good chance this team will be overrated, at least to start. Everybody wants to back the Sabres in some capacity, it seems, whether that's betting on them to make the playoffs or betting on rookie goaltender Devin Levi to win the Calder Trophy. I really think you're all trying way too hard to will this stuff into existence. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to see the Sabres back in the playoffs. It would be great for Buffalo. It would be great for the NHL. It would be great if it happened. It's just not likely their year. And it might not be Tampa Bay's year either, because the projected Atlantic Division standings experienced quite a shakeup when it was announced last week that Andrei Vasilevsky will miss 8 to 10 weeks after having back surgery. The news caused the Lightning's playoff chances to drop from 62 to 48%, but that has mostly been accounted for in the betting market. And I think the opportunity to capitalize on that news, yeah, it's come and gone. Sportsbooks have caught up. One of the best ways for me to explain what I mean is from a book called The Logic of Sports Betting, where the authors compare getting good bets to getting good deals on Black Friday. In other words, if you're not standing outside the store waiting for it to open when you know there's going to be a good deal, you're going to get the leftovers, or worse, you're not going to get a deal at all. So in situations like this, unless a sports book is really slow to react, you're going to miss out on the good bets if you're not plugged into breaking news 24/7. Like Buffalo, a lot of people see the Senators as a team on the rise, and they are. But while their playoff chances have gone up since we found out that the Lightning have lost their most important player, the forecast calls for the Senators to make the playoffs just 48% of the time. I think that's pretty good. I know it'll rub some people the wrong way, but they didn't have a great offseason, and their defense still has some holes. I think you can be hopefully optimistic about their goaltending. It might be good. Feel free to bet on the Senators to make the playoffs at plus money if you disagree. I don't think it's necessarily a bad bet at plus 115, but I don't think it's really a good one either. I was talking to my good friend Don Lucian about what he thinks, what people get wrong when making predictions for a new season, and player growth came up. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because I think a lot of people look at young players and think that player growth is linear, that these players are just going to continue to progress on an upward trajectory until they reach their full potential. But I would ask people that think that, like, have you watched hockey? That's not what happens most times. There's ups and downs and ebbs and flows. Players rarely progress on a linear trajectory like that. So definitely some growing pains still in store for the Senators, but I do think they have a better chance of making the playoffs than the Sabres, and that mostly has to do with the tandem of Jonas Korpisalo and Anton Forsberg. The latter back to 100% after tearing both MCLs last season. Ouch. Next up is the Florida Panthers. Last season's deep playoff run came at a cost, as the Panthers will be shorthanded on the blue line. Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour are both expected to be out until mid-December. So aside from Gustav Forsling, the only returning defenseman from last year on Florida's roster is Josh Mahura. They added 4 defensemen in the offseason: Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Dmitry Kulikov, Niko Mikkola, and Mike Riley to compensate for the losses of Ekblad, Montour, Radko Gudas, and Eric Stahl. Still, the Panthers finished with 98 average points and made the playoffs 69% of the time. Very nice. Number 2 is the Boston Bruins. I know that might surprise some. Even the most optimistic forecasts had Boston taking a step back in 2022-23, but they did the exact opposite and set the record for most wins and most points in a season. The Bruins' defense and goaltending is still among the best in the league. They've got a couple of superstar forwards in David Pastrnak and Brad Marchand, even if the latter is over 35 years old. But there is a giant hole down the middle now that Patrice Bergeron and to a lesser extent David Krejci have retired. And not to mention, they also lost former MVP Taylor Hall and all of their trade deadline acquisitions like Dmitry Orlov and Tyler Bertuzzi. Still, there's a pretty solid hockey team here, at least on paper, and the Bruins should be all right. And at number one in the Atlantic Division, it is the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, don't expect to ever see me wearing a Maple Leafs jersey, but I am reluctantly rooting for them to win the Atlantic Division in 2023-24. After adjusting for Vasilevsky's absence, Toronto's chances of finishing first in the division shot up from 45% to 48%. But Sports Interaction still has the Maple Leafs listed at plus 220 to win the Atlantic. I don't love all the moves that Toronto made this offseason, but the Maple Leafs are the most complete team in the group, believe it or not, and the changes to Boston's roster certainly helps their chances of finishing with the most points. But I know nobody's going to care what any projection model says about the Maple Leafs and their chances of advancing through the Stanley Cup playoffs. So, as far as the Metro goes, I've got the Philadelphia Flyers finishing in last place. And let me start by saying I have absolutely nothing against the Flyers or their fans, and I probably wouldn't be saying any of this if I was in the Wells Fargo Center or a Philadelphia sports bar. But I hope the Flyers absolutely soil themselves this season. Once again, not because I have anything against the team. I just don't think they're very good. My projection model gives them a 20% chance of finishing last place in 32nd overall. In American odds, that's plus 400, which provides a lot of incentive for me to bet the Flyers to finish in last place at plus 850. Their current odds available at Sports Interaction. You could also bet the Flyers to finish under 75.5 regular season points because it's almost 5 points higher than where I expect them to finish, but it's not a low risk, high reward bet. And I know that is the type of bet that you're all looking for. So Flyers to finish in last place at plus 850. The next team that we'll talk about in the Metro is, of course, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, if there's one forecast that makes me feel a little bit uneasy, it's the Blue Jackets at 77 points. The Blue Jackets have arguably been the worst defensive team in the league the last couple of seasons, but they've added some depth to the roster that was incredibly injured in 2022-23. Columbus finished with 545 man games lost, the second most in the NHL. Most notably, defenseman Zach Werenski only played 13 games in 2022-23. It's a good thing nobody can coerce me into putting my money where my projections are, though, because it's the biggest advantage that you have as a bettor. Sportsbooks, they have to post lines. We don't have to make bets. If they want action, they've got to put it up. But, we have the ultimate say in whether or not we want to make a bet. If it doesn't suit our needs, we don't have to make it. So my projections, they can help me find good bets, but I don't just blindly bet every perceived edge, and I don't think you should either. There will be plenty of time to find good bets throughout the season, and how you build your betting portfolio is completely up to you, and that goes for me too. So I'm not going to bet on the Blue Jackets here, despite the fact that my projections model sees them a little differently than the betting market. Now, moving on to the Capitals, I don't know if I've wiped the egg off of my face after I suggested Washington was a good futures bet in a few different markets, like the Stanley Cup. They were a long shot, of course. But I thought they had a good chance to end up in the playoff spot at the end of the season. Instead, they just played 4 games with all 6 of the players that remained from the 2018 Stanley Cup winning roster, and they finished 6th in the Metropolitan Division as a result. Expectations are much lower heading into this season, and the Capitals project to miss the playoffs almost 80% of the time. The team sort of made it clear that they're looking to stay just competitive enough to allow Alex Ovechkin to catch Gordie Howe's all-time goal-scoring record, but unless they have great injury luck, which they didn't last year, it's tough to see them making any noise. Still, I think Darcy Kemper is a really good goaltender, and there's a chance that the stars align for them on offense as they drop from 10th to 20th in goals per 60 over the last 2 seasons. So maybe the Capitals have a return to form, but it's going to be tough in a tough Eastern Conference. And the next team, the New York Islanders, will have something to say about that. But, for the sake of trying to avoid dealing with their small but very vocal fan base, I'm going to keep this really short when it comes to the Islanders. Ilya Sorokin, he's going to win a Vezina Trophy one of these years, or at least he would in a perfect world. And if he's able to help the Islanders secure a playoff berth this season, then it might be his year. He's the favorite to win the award. The Islanders played well down the stretch, I guess, mostly without Barzal. So it'll be interesting to see what they can do with both Barzal and Horvat in the lineup for an entire season. New York went 17-9-4 between February 1st and the end of the season, but 26 of their final 30 games were against non-playoff teams for the most part, and teams that were knocked out in the first round. It's a good sign, don't get me wrong, but not exactly a harbinger for having future success. It made sense that the Islanders found their legs in the second half, as 52% of their first 52 games were against playoff teams. So my projection of 92.5 points lines up exactly with the sports book. So I won't be betting on the Islanders in any way, shape, or form or against them just yet. And I won't be betting on Sorokin to win the Vezina. I think NHL general managers are really lazy when it comes to voting for the best goaltender. In fact, I think some probably even delegate the task to someone on their staff as just kind of a throwaway. So seeing Sorokin at the top of the Vezina Trophy odds board kind of is a little bit perplexing, just because the Islanders don't really have a great shot at making the playoffs. And if they don't, he's probably not in the running. Now, Pittsburgh made arguably the biggest splash of the offseason, of course, landing defenseman Erik Karlsson fresh off a 101-point season and his third Norris Trophy win, and that should help keep them in the thick of the playoff race. They also added Riley Smith, a forward from the Vegas Golden Knights, fresh off a Stanley Cup. All in all, the Penguins had a pretty strong offseason, but the Eastern Conference is loaded, so their playoff chances are around 58% with a point projection that's slightly lower than the market. Jake Gensel should only miss about 5 games. That's great, according to the team. It sounds like rumors about Tristan Jarry's health were maybe blown out of proportion last season. If that's the case, the Penguins can make another run at the Stanley Cup, but I'm not betting on a tandem of Tristan Jarry and newly acquired Alex Nedeljkovic, who is coming off 2 very rough years in Detroit. The Rangers, on the other hand, I am interested in. New York sacrificed some defense for offense last season, and I thought it worked out pretty good. It resulted in the team scoring about as many goals as Evolving Hockey's expected goals model said they should have. And that's the sort of thing heading into this season that kind of gives me confidence. Igor Shesterkin has stopped 65 goals above expected over the last 2 seasons, and by focusing on offense, it'll make it a lot harder for teams to compete if he's able to continue to play at that level. So I like the addition of Blake Wheeler. It's a positive one, even though he is at the tail end of his career. I'm actually kind of excited about this next bet, which is on the New York Rangers to win the President's Trophy, i.e., finish with the most points at 20-1 odds. My projection model gives the Rangers a decent chance to win the Metropolitan Division, and they make a good bet to do so. But, spoiler alert, the Hurricanes are projected to finish with about 5 more average points than the Rangers. So, with about a 13% chance of winning the President's Trophy and around a 20% chance of winning the Metro at plus 450 odds, the edge that I think I have is about the same regardless of whatever bet I make. So, I'm drawn to the bigger payout at longer odds, even if it means that I'll be wrong more often than I'll be right. So I'm on the Rangers to win the President's Trophy at plus 2,000. The New Jersey Devils, they're a super fun team to watch, and I'm excited to see what they're going to accomplish in the future. But despite his strong showing, particularly in the playoffs, there's a lot riding on rookie goaltender Akira Smith, and similarly, there's a lot riding on Vitek Vanacek, who really hasn't proven himself yet. The Devils were among the top teams in every meaningful category, though, and most notably, they were the second best team through the lens of expected goals, according to Evolving Hockey. And with a projection of 108.6 average points in the forecast, there is technically value betting on the Devils to go over 106.5 points, but that's a big number and not the type of bet I'm trying to make. There are probably better ways to tie up your bankroll in Devils futures if that's your prerogative, like betting on them to win the Metro Division or finish with the most points. But as I mentioned, I'm taking my money elsewhere in the Metro for now, and I am also making a bet on the Carolina Hurricanes, who are one of the most popular picks to finish first, not only in the Metropolitan Division or the Eastern Conference, but the entire NHL. And naturally, they have the best odds of accomplishing those feats. My projection model has the Hurricanes as the best team in the NHL with 110 points on average in the forecast. The projection model gives them a 43% chance of winning the Metro Division. Compare that to the plus 170 odds offered by Sports Interaction, which converts to about a 36% chance, and you've got yourself a value bet. However, Eastern Conference teams face a tougher schedule overall based on the average points projected for each team, and that has resulted in the top Western Conference teams combining to have better average odds of winning the regular season than the Eastern Conference teams. In other words, the Western Conference is a little bit easier for the likes of Colorado, Edmonton, Dallas, and Vegas, but only one of those teams is my favorite bet to win the President's Trophy. But before we get into the Western Conference projections, I would really appreciate it if you could pause the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button on the Canada Sports Betting YouTube channel. It would really help us as we try to grow this channel and this show. But without further ado, let's get into the Central Division. At number 8, it's the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, I think a good measure of whether or not I'll be able to help you become a better sports bettor is how you view the NHL draft lottery. Do you think it's rigged because the Chicago Blackhawks won with the third best odds? If so, then I don't know if I or anybody else can help you when it comes to sports betting. It is a math problem more than anything after all. So the Blackhawks, they won despite having the third best odds. The Anaheim Ducks had the best odds at 24.5%. That means there was a 74.5% chance that they wouldn't win. Don't make me get all Scott Steiner here, please. Bedard, he's going to be a blast to watch. He's got one of the best shots we've ever seen. He can get it off in a variety of ways. And it's good that the Blackhawks have surrounded him with some veteran players like Taylor Hall, Nick Foligno, and Corey Perry, even if we wish the latter would just go away already and never return. But Bedard, while he will likely make some noise, I really doubt that the Blackhawks are going to make any noise as a team this season. The forecast calls for 73 average points, and the Blackhawks only made the playoffs 2% of the time. And don't expect big things out of the Arizona Coyotes either. I mean, don't even expect them to be the Coyotes next season, but don't count them out this season. I think I like the fact that they added some veteran players like Jason Zucker, Alex Kerfoot, and Nick Bukestad, while also adding defenseman Sean Durzi to the mix. Clayton Keller is coming off a career year. Nick Schmaltz is basically a point per game player. Barrett Hayton looks like the real deal. And of course, Logan Cooley, he looks ready to play in the NHL. So there's a lot to like here about this Coyotes team. Maybe more so than anything else, though, is Karel Vejmelka, their goalie. I think he's good. He seems good. Anyway, I know my friend Michael Lieboff from the Action Network's Line Change podcast is a big Arizona Coyotes fan heading into this season. He likes the head coach, Andre Tourigny, to win the Jack Adams at a big price. The Coyotes are projected to finish with 79.4 points, according to the forecast, which is about 3 points higher than their regular season total at Sports Interaction. But if you're going to bet on the Coyotes to exceed expectations, why not take Michael's advice and punt on the coach at long odds? Doing that at 66-1 is better value than betting on the Coyotes to make the playoffs at plus 475, because if they do somehow find their way into a wild card spot or otherwise, you can just about guarantee that Tourigny is going to be in the running for the coach of the year. Now, it's worth noting that Michael was able to find 100-1, so definitely have a look around before you make a bet. When you shop around for the best odds on the bets that you like, you win a little bit more when your bets come through, and or at the very least, you lose a little bit less when they don't. So always shop around for the best price as much as possible. At number 6, it's the St. Louis Blues, and I've already talked about how I would really love it if the Flyers soil themselves this season and finish in last place. I told you how it's nothing personal. Well, the same goes for the St. Louis Blues, but it's a much bigger long shot. Unlike the Flyers, who I expect will finish last about 20% of the time, I only expect the Blues to finish in last place about 2% of the time. But because their odds of finishing in last place are listed at 66-1, which carries an implied chance of 1.5%, I can absolutely justify betting a small amount on them to finish in last place, have an awful season, and I can also bet on them to finish with fewer than 86.5 points, because the projection model says they'll end up with about 82.5 points. The Blues, they had the third best shooting percentage in the NHL last season, and they still finished 6th in the Central Division. I like the addition of Kevin Hayes, but I don't think it's enough to get back into the playoffs, especially if Jordan Binnington continues to play poorly like he has. Nashville is an interesting team. You've got UC Saros, a perennial Vezina Trophy candidate, because he's one of the most consistent goalies in the NHL and has been since his rookie season in 2016-17. His career save percentage is .919, but in 7 seasons, it's never drifted below .914, which is absolutely incredible. But a few years ago, you could get Saros to win the Vezina Trophy at 20-1 odds or longer. Now he's a co-favorite at 6-1, and not a whole lot has changed beside the public's perception. He's always been this good, but that's why I don't think he's a good bet to win the award anymore. And I just wanted to get that out of the way, because I do think that people are eager to bet on Saros. As far as the team goes, I think there's some stuff to like here. Obviously, Saros, we talked about him. Roman Yossi, he's a perennial award contender at his own position, and Philip Forsberg, a really great offensive player. And I like the addition of Ryan O'Reilly. I think he can fit nicely with the team. But until they prove that there's more here than meets the eye, I think Nashville is a team that will likely be on the outside of the playoff picture with a projection of 86.7 average points and a 29% chance of making the playoffs. And then there's the Winnipeg Jets. Blake Wheeler is out as team captain after signing a 1 year deal with the New York Rangers, and Pierre Luc Dubois was traded to the Los Angeles Kings. So the Jets' forecast is a little bit more pessimistic than it would have been otherwise. However, I think Winnipeg GM Kevin Cheveldayoff did pretty good, all things considered, as he was able to immediately add Gabriel Velarde, a former number 11 overall pick in 2017, and Alex Iafallo, an undrafted player who has carved out a pretty good career for himself in his time with the Kings. And the Jets still have their most important player, Connor Hellebuck, at least for now. And Hellebuck has helped the team get to the playoffs in 5 out of the last 6 seasons. But I mean, looking at this roster, it's probably going to be the biggest challenge for Hellebuck yet, assuming that he does stick around for the entirety of this campaign. I think the Jets are in a pretty good spot, though, all things considered. A 43% chance to make the playoffs, a projection of 90 points. Once again, not bad. And maybe they can overtake a team like the Minnesota Wild, who I think are a perfect example of a boring team that is probably not going to suck, but they're probably not going to run away with any hardware either. I mean, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Zuccarello are one of the most dynamic duos in the NHL. Matthew Boldy looks like he's well on his way to becoming a very good NHL player. There's a lot of hype about Marco Rossi heading into the season, but even if all of those things work out, I think the Wild are still a little light on star power, and that's not great. Hopefully, for their sake, their goaltending continues to hold up. Honestly, I don't think there's a lot to talk about here. The projection model sees them as a 95-point team, and while it's important to remember that there are a range of possible outcomes, some higher, some lower, chances are we're looking at a middle of the road team with a 68% chance of making the playoffs. The latter mostly has to do with the fact that they play in a weak division. Only Colorado and Dallas are true contenders. So let's talk about those teams. Some people might be surprised to find out that I have the Avalanche listed as the second best team in the Central Division. And I can't really talk about the Avalanche from a betting perspective without talking about the Stars. So let's just do it all at once. I don't believe that the Stars are all that much better than the Avalanche. Nothing like that. I just think, and I think most people would agree, that the public's perception of the Avalanche is much stronger than that of the Stars. I have the Avalanche projected to finish with 105.4 points. The Stars projected to finish with 106.7 points, so not a big difference. And if you look at how these teams stacked up against one another last year, especially at 5-on-5, they were mere images of each other, at least through the lens of the data that's publicly available to us. And when you account for all situations, the Stars actually grade out as a better team, and therefore it's a bit odd to see such a gap in their Central Division odds. The forecast has the Stars winning the division almost 49% of the time, while the Avalanche win about 41% of the time. And that makes the Stars a good bet at plus 250, but that's not the only market where the Stars are undervalued in. Personally, I feel like the Stanley Cup is one of those markets as well, despite typically being the worst betting market leading up to the season that a bettor can bet into. I think the Dallas Stars do offer some value at 16-1. They have the ninth shortest odds, but I personally think that only 4 teams should have better odds of winning the Stanley Cup than they do, and their price should be closer to 11 or 12-1. They are in the mix as one of the top teams, but at 16-1, they're a bit of a longer shot than most, and I think there's some value there for sure. And with that, there's just one group of teams left to talk about, and it's the Pacific Division. We'll start with the Trash. The Sharks started last season with Erik Karlsson and Timo Meier. They traded Timo Meier away at the trade deadline, and then later in the summer facilitated a trade for Erik Karlsson to the Penguins. The projection is this 68.7 average points, which might end up being on the high side for all we know. The Sharks have a 28% chance of finishing in last place according to the forecast, which makes them the team that's most likely to do so this season. But I would not recommend betting on them because the odds, which currently are at plus 275, represent a 27% chance. In fact, it would be like betting on a coin flip at even money that has a 50% chance of landing on heads or tails. It just doesn't make any sense to do so. And the same goes for the Ducks, who I have projected to finish with 72.2 average points. Once again, this could very well be on the high side, but we also have to remember that a lot of these teams tanked very hard for Connor Bedard last season, and there's not as much incentive to do so this season. Now, just like Ottawa in the East, Vancouver thinks they've got a playoff team in the West, but the odds tell a different story, as does the projection model. Sports Interaction has the Canucks listed at 88.5 regular season points, with the forecast saying that they're going to finish with 87.5. So not a big difference. But when it comes to their playoff chances, Sports Interaction lists the Canucks at plus 145 that makes the playoffs, which translates to an implied chance of almost 41%, and I don't agree with that. My projection model sees the Canucks making the playoffs about 30% of the time. Now, I know the game of hockey is not played on a spreadsheet or in any kind of programming language, but sports betting kind of is to some degree, and the Canucks just don't show up as a playoff team right now because there are, by my count, at least 8 or 9 teams that deserve to be projected to finish ahead of them based on their performance last season. So I've got to ask a question. Do the Kraken have the ingredients of a Stanley Cup champion, or are they just a deep team that maybe, if everything goes right, can go on a deep playoff run before getting bounced in round 2 or 3? I'm kind of leaning towards the latter, and my projection model seems to agree with 94.4 average points in the forecast. But with a 2% chance of winning the Stanley Cup, there's some value betting on the Kraken at 50 to 1 to do so. And I'm just wondering, should I make this bet, or should I just chalk it up as an oversight? I'm kind of leaning towards the latter because I don't think the Kraken have what it takes to go all the way. But I would love to hear what you think about Seattle in the comments, so let me know. At number 4, it's the Calgary Flames. Now, last year's version of the Flames, they were a paper tiger. They not only failed to live up to expectations, but they failed to make the playoffs altogether. The Flames had entered the season as the Pacific Division favorite. There were very high hopes, and they remained somewhat of an analytics darling throughout most of the season. And as a result, only the Anaheim Ducks and San Jose Sharks were worse in terms of profitability for bettors last season. It really couldn't have gone any worse for the Calgary Flames. The uncertainty surrounding how the new players like Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri would fit in caused a lot of us sports bettors to make bad predictions and ultimately bad bets, and nobody wants that to happen this time around. Technically, Calgary is a good bet to make the playoffs at minus 145, as my projection model sees the Flames' playoff chances being about 9% higher at 68%, but I was wrong about them last season, and I do feel like I do have some clarity in regards to how good the team is now. There's some added uncertainty with projecting how Ryan Huska will fit in as a new head coach and the degree to which players like Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri could bounce back. All I know about the Calgary Flames is this: I am not looking forward to betting on the Flames, watching them outshoot teams, often by a wide margin for 60 plus minutes, only to have them lose a 1-goal game in regulation, overtime, or worse, a shootout, because it happened far too often last season. Rounding out the top 3 is the LA Kings. Now, I love the addition of Pierre-Luc Dubois for Los Angeles, particularly for what he brings on offense. The Kings are already really good defensively. They ranked 5th in expected goals per 60 minutes in all situations last season, so adding a star player like PLD to the mix should complement this team nicely. But they did give up a lot, and that could end up hurting them. Time will tell, but I think right now the Kings, as they stand, have a pretty good roster, and they can at least live up to the expectations set last season and maybe even take a step forward come playoff time. That is, unless the goaltending tandem of Cam Talbot and Phoenix Copley put them in a tough spot, which it very well could. Thankfully, I've really got no interest in betting on or against the Kings in any of the offered futures markets right now, so I guess I'll deal with them as the season goes on. All right, 2 teams left. One is the reigning Stanley Cup champion. The other is the best team in the Pacific Division. Are you surprised? Well, you shouldn't be. Come on, it's the Edmonton Oilers. They're going to crush the regular season. Sure, Vegas won the Pacific without Mark Stone for half a season, but the Oilers came out of the gate pretty slow last season and just about recovered. Edmonton was 21-17-3 to start the year, but they went 29-6-6 the rest of the way, and the Western Conference hasn't gotten any tougher. So head coach Jay Woodcroft spoke recently about how he's been preaching that you can only control what's in your immediate control: practice, the game in front of you, how you prepare, etc. Maybe it's coach speak, but I think it blends well with what the Oilers want to do here. They're a determined group that wants to win now. and they can come out of the gate strong and take it one game at a time. They might be really hard to keep up with if they do that. Everything changes when the playoffs start, of course, and an 82 game season becomes a best of seven. But you don't have to worry about that if you're only betting on the Oilers to win the Pacific Division or even finish with the most points, both of which I think are good bets. Remember, I said earlier that the top four Western Conference teams had better odds of winning the President's Trophy on average than the top four Eastern Conference teams. That's because the teams further down the standings aren't as good in the West as they are in the East. So while Carolina is sitting at plus 650 odds to finish with the most points, teams like Edmonton and Vegas are sitting at plus 900 and plus 1100 respectively. And my projection model says the Oilers have as good of a chance as the Hurricanes of winning the regular season, 18%. The Golden Knights are a good bet too, but because I have Edmonton projected to finish with more points, I am going to bet the Oilers because there's a little bit more value doing so. All right, that does it for the 2023-24 standings projections presented by Canada Sports Betting here on the Puck Portfolio. If you haven't already, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. Can't wait to get this season started.